There is a scene in the summer of 30 BC that has haunted historians for over 2,000 years, and it begins with a sealed door. Inside a sealed mausoleum on the edge of Alexandria, a woman sits surrounded by her two handmaidens and the accumulated treasure of a dynasty that stretches back nearly 3 centuries. Outside the barred doors, the armies of Rome are already in the streets of her city. Her kingdom is gone. Her lover is dead, carried dying through the window of this very building only hours earlier because the doors were too dangerous to open, hoisted up the exterior walls by ropes while she pulled from above, weeping, hauling a dying man toward her because it was the last thing she could do for him. Now, she is alone. The greatest military power in the ancient world has just arrived to collect its prize. And this woman, this last queen of Egypt, is calmly deciding that Rome will not have her. She is 39 years old. She is Cleopatra VII Philopater, the 7th queen of that name, the last active ruler of a dynasty that governed Egypt for 275 years, the most powerful woman in the ancient world, and she has already made her decision. In a matter of minutes, she will be dead. Not because she was overwhelmed exactly. She was defeated, yes, thoroughly and finally, but because she refused to accept the terms of defeat that Octavian had designed for her, which were humiliation in chains in the streets of Rome, displayed like a captured animal for a crowd that had never seen a queen before and would not know what to do with one now. She chose the snake instead, or the poison, and in choosing her own death over Octavian's triumph, she denied Rome the one thing it most wanted. That act, that final act of sovereignty in a sealed room at the end of everything, is what made her immortal. So what happened after that? What happened to the children she left behind, to the civilization she had fought for decades to protect, to the dynasty Rome now had to figure out how to erase? Because the story does not end in that mausoleum. It continues in the streets of Rome, in the palaces of North Africa, in the slow, methodical erasure of everything she had built, and in the remarkable survival, against every odd imaginable, of at least one of her children. Let me take you through the full story, because the details are stranger, more heartbreaking, and more extraordinary than most people realize. To understand how she fell, you first have to understand what she actually was. Because here's the thing that almost nobody teaches. Cleopatra was not Egyptian, she was Macedonian Greek. Her dynasty, the Ptolemaic dynasty, had been founded in 305 BC by Ptolemy I Soter, one of the generals of Alexander the Great, who had carved Egypt out of the chaos following Alexander's death and made it his personal kingdom. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemaic pharaohs had ruled Egypt as Greek kings in an Egyptian land, speaking Greek at court, marrying within the family with a consistency that would make a modern geneticist extremely uncomfortable, and maintaining a cultural and linguistic barrier between themselves and the tens of millions of people they governed that was so complete it was almost architectural. Egypt's people spoke Egyptian, the court spoke Greek, and in nearly 300 years of Ptolemaic rule, not one member of the dynasty had troubled themselves to bridge that gap. Until Cleopatra. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language, and she did not stop there. She eventually mastered 9 languages in total, including Hebrew, Aramaic, Ethiopian, and the languages of several of Egypt's trading partners along the African coast. She was trained in mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and rhetoric. She administered the most complex economic system in the ancient Mediterranean with a precision that her predecessors had never matched. She was, by any objective standard, one of the most intellectually formidable human beings of the ancient world, which makes the way history has chosen to remember her primarily as a seductress, as a woman defined entirely by the men she loved, as a kind of ancient femme fatale with a talent for dramatic exits, one of the more revealing failures of collective memory that the historical record contains. She was not primarily a lover, she was primarily a ruler. She came to power at 18, inheriting a kingdom already in decline, already orbiting the gravitational pull of Rome, already hemorrhaging territory and the kind of authority that had once made the Ptolemaic pharaohs the wealthiest rulers on earth. Egypt was still rich. Its grain fed the Mediterranean world. Its libraries contained the accumulated knowledge of centuries. Alexandria was the intellectual capital of the known world, home to the greatest library ever assembled into scholars, merchants, and artists, who made it unlike anywhere else. But Egypt's independence was increasingly a fiction maintained by Roman sufferance, and Cleopatra understood this with a clarity that her predecessors had conspicuously lacked. Her early reign was not secure. The dynasty she had inherited was already in its long, final decline. Her own father, Ptolemy XII, had been so desperate for Roman recognition that he had paid the Roman general Pompey 6,000 talents of silver, an almost incomprehensible sum, simply to have Rome officially acknowledge his right to sit on his own throne. He had borrowed the money from Roman bankers to do it, which meant that Egypt was effectively mortgaged to the city that would eventually swallow it. When he died, he left Cleopatra not just a kingdom, but a debt and a warning written into every coin of that debt about how precarious her position actually was. Her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, backed by powerful court advisors who considered a teenage girl easier to manipulate than a determined woman, drove her into exile in Syria when she was barely 20. She had spent the first years of her reign fighting to establish her authority, to demonstrate that she was not a figurehead or a ceremonial presence, but an actual governing monarch. And for her trouble, she found herself in the desert with a small army and no obvious path back to her own throne. Her strategy was not seduction, it was survival. And the tool she reached for was alliance, because alliance with Rome was the only force capable of keeping Egypt from becoming a Roman province. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC, chasing his defeated rival Pompey, he found a kingdom in the middle of a civil war between Cleopatra and her brother. She had herself smuggled into the palace past her brother's guards, reportedly concealed in a linen sack or a rolled carpet depending on which ancient source you prefer. And when Caesar opened it, he encountered one of the most remarkable people he had ever met in a lifetime of meeting remarkable people. She spoke to him in Latin. She had a plan, and she made it clear within the first conversation that she was the ruler Egypt needed if Caesar wanted a stable and cooperative ally rather than a fractured and hostile client state. They became allies, then lovers, then parents when Cleopatra gave birth to a son she named Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. Caesar installed her on the Egyptian throne, neutralized her brother, and spent several months in Alexandria before Roman politics pulled him back. He brought her to Rome, where she lived in his villa across the Tiber, and caused considerable scandal among Rome's aristocracy, who found the presence of a foreign queen in the capital simultaneously fascinating and deeply threatening. He was assassinated on the Ides of March, 44 BC, and Cleopatra understood immediately that her protector was gone, and that Egypt's position now depended entirely on who emerged victorious from the civil war his death ignited. The answer, for a decade, was Mark Antony, Caesar's most powerful general, ruler of the Eastern Roman world, charismatic, militarily brilliant, and possessed of appetites that made him simultaneously magnetic and dangerous. When he summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus in 41 BC to explain why Egypt had not more actively supported his cause during the war, she arrived not as a supplicant responding to a summons, but as a sovereign receiving a foreign dignitary, sailing into the harbor on a gilded barge with perfumed sails and silver oars, while crowds lined the shore to watch. Antony, waiting on his official tribunal in the marketplace, found that his audience had simply left to go and see the arrival instead. She was making a point about the balance of power between them, and she made it with spectacular precision. They became allies, then lovers, then something closer to a partnership of genuine equals than the ancient world had ever produced between a man and a woman in positions of real authority. Antony moved the center of his eastern administration to Alexandria, and for years the city was the seat of a rival power that Rome watched with increasing unease. They lived in extraordinary luxury, hosting nightly banquets of a scale that became legendary even to a world accustomed to royal excess, but they also governed together, making military and diplomatic decisions jointly, projecting a combined power that stretched from the Euphrates to the borders of Ethiopia. She gave him 3 children, twins named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and a younger son named Ptolemy Philadelphus. He gave her territory, Roman legions, and the grandest political ambition either of them had ever entertained. In 34 BC, in a ceremony in Alexandria that Romans called the Donations of Alexandria, Antony formally divided the Eastern world among Cleopatra and her children. Cleopatra was declared Queen of Kings. Caesarion was named King of Kings and co-ruler of Egypt alongside her. The three younger children were assigned kingdoms stretching from Armenia to Syria to North Africa. It was the most audacious act of the entire alliance, a direct statement that the center of power in the Eastern Mediterranean was shifting from Rome to Alexandria. It was also the moment that handed Octavian everything he needed to destroy them. The Propaganda War. Octavian ran against Antony and Cleopatra was one of the most effective political campaigns in ancient history. He portrayed Antony as a man who had abandoned his Roman identity, his Roman wife Octavia, his Roman values, and his Roman gods, surrendering himself to a foreign queen who had bewitched him into treason against his own civilization. He had Antony's will read publicly in Rome, revealing that Antony had asked to be buried in Alexandria rather than Rome. The Roman Senate declared war not on Antony, who was still technically a Roman general, but on Cleopatra. It was a masterstroke. Rome was not fighting a civil war against one of its own. It was defending itself against a foreign queen who had seduced one of its greatest men into forgetting who he was. The framing was entirely dishonest and entirely successful. The Battle of Actium, fought off the western coast of Greece on September 2, 31 BC, was in many ways a disaster already in motion before the first ship moved. Antony and Cleopatra's forces had been weakened by disease, defections, and the grinding attrition of months of stalemate on the Greek coast. When Cleopatra's squadron broke through the Roman lines and sailed for Egypt, and when Antony followed her, abandoning his fleet mid-battle, it was effectively over. Their land armies deserted within days. Egypt was now exposed directly to Roman invasion, and both of them understood with complete clarity what that meant. The months that followed were a study in how powerful people behave when they know the end is coming, but cannot quite bring themselves to stop moving forward. Antony fell into a deep depression, withdrawing from everyone for days at a time. Cleopatra prepared with the methodical focus that had always been her real talent. She moved her treasury into her mausoleum. She sent messengers to Octavian, testing terms, offering concessions, searching for some arrangement that might at minimum protect her children's safety, even if her kingdom was beyond saving. Octavian replied with smooth, non-committal reassurances that promised nothing specific and bound him to nothing. He was managing her expectations while his armies marched on Alexandria, which they reached in the summer of 30 BC. When Antony was falsely told that Cleopatra had already died, he tried to kill himself, stabbing himself in the stomach with his own sword. The wound was not immediately fatal. He was carried, dying, to the sealed mausoleum where Cleopatra had barricaded herself. The doors could not safely be opened. His men hoisted him up through a high window by ropes, and Cleopatra pulled from above, bloodied, as the ancient sources describe it with an unflinching vividness, dragging her dying general upward toward her arms. He died there. She was taken into custody by Octavian's soldiers shortly afterward. She met with Octavian himself in a session that the ancient sources record carefully. She tried to charm him, to negotiate, to find some angle that might save something. He was polite, composed, and entirely unmoved. She had watched Julius Caesar's triumph in Rome decades earlier, with Egyptian prisoners displayed for the entertainment of the crowd. She understood precisely what Octavian was planning. On August 12, 30 BC, Octavian's men found Cleopatra dead in her mausoleum. Her handmaiden Iris lay dead beside her. Charmian was dying, still adjusting the diadem on Cleopatra's head with her final strength, making certain the queen looked correct when they found her. When one of Octavian's soldiers demanded whether this was well done, Charmian replied, with whatever breath remained, that it was extremely well done and entirely fit for a queen descended from so many kings. Then she died too. The method remains genuinely uncertain 2,000 years later. The snake, the asp smuggled in a basket of figs, is the famous version. Poison hidden under a pin is another. She made sure no one would ever know for certain. It was her last act of sovereignty, and like all of her acts of sovereignty, it was perfectly executed. Octavian was reportedly furious. He had been robbed of his triumph centerpiece. He brought in specialists said to have the ability to draw snake venom from a body, but it was too late. He gave her a royal burial beside Antony in the mausoleum she had built herself. Even in that, she had managed something. She was not paraded, she was not displayed. She was buried as a queen. But Cleopatra had 4 children, and what happened to those children is the chapter that history has almost entirely neglected to tell. Caesarion was 17 years old when his mother died. As the son of Julius Caesar, he was the most dangerous living person to Octavian's ambitions and is claimed to be Caesar's sole legitimate heir. Octavian's advisors reportedly framed the problem with a phrase that has echoed across the centuries: there could not be 2 Caesars. Caesarion had been sent south for safety as the Roman armies approached Alexandria, but he was lured back with false promises of pardon and safe passage. He was captured and executed. He was 17 years old. His death ended the Ptolemaic dynasty as completely as a line drawn across everything that came before it. The 3 younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome. They were placed in the care of Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, the woman whose marriage Cleopatra had effectively displaced. Whether this was magnanimity or a calculated display of Roman moral superiority is a question historians still debate. It was probably both. But before they entered that relatively stable captivity, they were made to do something no child should be required to endure. They were marched through the streets of Rome in Octavian's triumph, displayed to the celebrating crowd as proof of Egypt's conquest. They were in chains. The chains, in a detail so pointed it seems designed specifically to illuminate the cruelty of empire, were made of gold. The crowd, which had turned out in vast numbers to watch the spectacle of Egypt's defeat, stared at 3 small children wearing gold chains and roared. The 2 youngest, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, disappear entirely from the historical record within a few years of arriving in Rome. They almost certainly died young, probably of illness, or simply of the profound disorientation of being children removed from everything they had ever known. History does not record how, or where, or who was present. They are simply gone, the way that inconvenient children of defeated enemies tend to become gone in the historical record. But Cleopatra Selene survived, and her story is the most remarkable footnote in the entire history of the Ptolemaic dynasty. She grew up in Rome under Octavia's roof, educated as a Roman aristocrat, valuable enough politically to be deployed as a diplomatic instrument by Augustus. He arranged her marriage to Juba II, the king of Mauritania, a North African kingdom corresponding roughly to modern Morocco and western Algeria. Juba was a fascinatingly parallel figure, a Numidian prince who had himself grown up in Rome after his own father's defeat, educated alongside Roman aristocrats, and installed as a client king by Augustus to manage the empire's western African frontier. Cleopatra Selene became queen of Mauritania, and what she did there speaks directly to who she was and where she came from. She named her capital Caesarea, a name that may honor Augustus, or may be a private act of mourning for her murdered brother Caesarion, and no historian has ever settled the question with certainty. She minted coins bearing her own portrait. Some of those coins display the crocodile, Egypt's ancient symbol, a deliberate statement of identity from a woman living thousands of miles from the kingdom she should have inherited. On some coins, she wrote her titles in both Greek and Latin, a bilingual declaration of who she was and where she came from, aimed at an audience that might otherwise have preferred she simply assimilate and forget. She built a court that attracted scholars, artists, and architects, preserving in the North African interior something of the Alexandrian intellectual world her mother had championed. She had a son with Juba II named Ptolemy, the last person in history to carry that royal name as part of a ruling dynasty. She died around 6 BC, in her early 40s, still a queen, her mother's name and her mother's refusal to be entirely erased intact across 2,000 miles of Mediterranean world. It was more than anyone would have predicted for her on the day they put the gold chains on her in Rome. Her son Ptolemy of Mauritania eventually succeeded his father and ruled for decades. He was killed in Rome around 40 AD, summoned there by the Emperor Caligula, who had him executed reportedly because he wore a magnificent purple cloak to the games that attracted more admiring attention from the crowd than Caligula considered appropriate. The last Ptolemaic bloodline ended not with a great battle or a political revolution, but with an emperor's wounded vanity over a garment. History can be like that. The consequences of Cleopatra's fall rippled through centuries in ways that are still being traced. Egypt's absorption into the Roman Empire gave Rome direct control over the grain supply that fed its entire population, making the province so strategically vital that Augustus refused to allow any Roman senator to even visit Egypt without his personal permission. He understood that whoever controlled Egypt's grain controlled Rome, and he intended to be the only person holding that lever. The fall of the Ptolemaic kingdom also marked the definitive end of the Hellenistic age, the extraordinary period following Alexander's conquests in which Greek culture had spread across the eastern Mediterranean and created a hybrid civilization of astonishing intellectual richness. The Library of Alexandria, which the Ptolemaic dynasty had built and funded for over 2 centuries, and which had accumulated at its height somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls representing the collected knowledge of the ancient world, was already in decline. It would eventually be destroyed entirely, though historians still argue about exactly when and by whom. What is not in dispute is that the institution that had made Alexandria the intellectual capital of the ancient world was a Ptolemaic creation, born from the ambition of Cleopatra's ancestors to make their adopted city the greatest on earth. Rome absorbed and reshaped the civilization the Ptolemies had built, eventually transmitting it to the medieval and modern worlds. But the Hellenistic world as an independent force, as a living alternative to Roman domination, ended in Alexandria in 30 BC. Egypt would not again be governed by a ruler based on its own soil and answerable primarily to its own people for the better part of 2,000 years. And then there is the question of memory. Because Cleopatra's legacy is perhaps the most complicated calculation in all of ancient history. Rome, which destroyed her, could never quite make itself forget her. She appeared in Roman poetry as a warning, as the emblem of Eastern excess and feminine danger and the corrupting power of foreign ambition. Horace celebrated her defeat. Virgil referenced her obliquely. Plutarch wrote her biography with an admiration he could not entirely disguise. But in the very act of warning against her, they kept her alive. Her name survived the fall of Rome itself, passed through the medieval world trailing legends, arrived in the Renaissance trailing more, and exploded into modernity through Shakespeare, who gave her the lines that still hang over her name 2 millennia after her death. Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety. Octavian got a month of the calendar named after him, a word most people now associate with the end of summer rather than the foundation of empire. She got 2,000 years of fascination, 5 Hollywood films, an Elizabeth Taylor, countless novels, operas, and plays, and a cultural presence that shows no sign of diminishing with time. In the longest possible view, she won. What lingers, beyond the grandeur and the geopolitics, is the human accounting. A woman of 39 in a sealed room making the last decision that was entirely her own. Her handmaidens dying beside her, one of them using her final breath to adjust the queen's diadem because Cleopatra should look correct when they found her. 3 children in gold chains marched through the streets of the city that had just destroyed everything they knew. One of those children growing up to become a queen herself in North Africa, minting coins stamped with a crocodile, naming her capital after a brother she was not allowed to grieve publicly. Preserving her mother's refusal to disappear into a kingdom Rome had assigned her as a consolation. And Caesarion, 17 years old, lured back across the desert with promises that were never intended to be honored, killed before he had the chance to become whatever he might have become. The Ptolemaic dynasty lasted from 305 BC to 30 BC, 275 years. It built the Library of Alexandria. It created the city that was the intellectual capital of the ancient Mediterranean for 3 centuries. It gave the world Cleopatra VII, who remains by any measure the most famous woman in the history of recorded civilization, and whose story has outlasted the empire that destroyed her, the empires that rose after that, and very nearly the concept of empire itself. And it ended in a mausoleum on the edge of a great city, with a woman who had governed one of the wealthiest kingdoms on earth, choosing her own death over the theater of someone else's victory, with 2 handmaidens who chose to die with her rather than live without her, with a crown that was adjusted one final time so that everything would look right. History has spent 2,000 years arguing about whether she was brilliant or reckless, Egyptian or Greek, victim or strategist, romantic or calculating. The answer, as with all people worth arguing about, is that the categories do not hold. She was more complicated, more capable, and more fully human than any of the versions of her that have come since. She was the last queen of Egypt, and she made absolutely certain that when she left on her own terms. If you found this story as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel grow, and it means I can keep making these deep dives into the figures who shaped the ancient and modern worlds alike. Drop a comment and tell me what you think. Was Cleopatra's alliance with Antony a fatal miscalculation, or was defeat at Actium simply inevitable regardless of what she chose? I will see you in the next one.